Welcome to another episode of the Christian Combatives Podcast. Today we are going to be discussing a law in Florida that bans children from attending adult live performances and the response from a furry convention. Their choice to ban children from attending the furry convention as a result of this law. I am joined today by one of the owners of the Christian Furry Fellowship, Thomcat. The article I'm reading says DeSantis law forces furry convention to bar children. Now, Tom, do you want to explain exactly what's going on here? Is this a law that is banning furries from Florida?
No. No. No, 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 no. The law itself doesn't say anything about furries at all. Like, the law itself is actually generally talking about, severe punishment for people allowing anyone considered a minor, anyone under 18, from being permitted to view adult live performances.
Yeah, I'm looking at the article here. It says adult live performances are defined in the bill as any show that depicts or simulates nudity, sexual content, sexual excitement, lewd conduct, or prosthetic genitalia. Um, but as a result, this group, Megaplex, I'm not familiar with them at all. Um, they've decided that they're not going to allow children to go to the convention at all. Now, is this because the furry every fur I've never been to one of these conventions. I don't necessarily plan on going. Have you ever gone to a convention?
Yeah, I've been to Furry Weekend Atlanta. That's the only one that I've been to. I've been, I think, 3 times in all, but only 2 times that I've actually stayed, like, for the weekend.
Is this something that you would allow your kids to go to, or would this be something where, you would keep them as far away as possible?
That's still something that I've been trying to wrestle with a little bit because, like, I think that it should be fine to take my kid to a convention, and I think that typically the way the rules for FWA and probably some other cons have been stated is that in the general space of the convention, it's supposed to be a family-friendly environment for the most part. And FWA specifically has even like made it to where anything they have that would be considered adult, where you have to be 18 or older to actually attend, would happen like late at night and would be in specific places. Uh, Dealers' dens will oftentimes have adult stuff for sale. And when I was in the last time I went, which wasn't this year but the year previous, it seemed like they had done more work to segregate the adult portions of the dealer's den so that that wasn't as visible. Like there was specifically in another room where those wares were being sold. And not all the time, but for the most part, artists did do a very good job, I think, of having in their art books like a clear like divider saying don't go past this page, right? Unless you want to see stuff that's like not so wholesome. Um, but even if the rules state that things need to be family friendly, what constitutes family friendly, what's considered just normal cosplay, even if it's tongue in cheek something else, is probably kind of hard to draw an explicit line on. And I feel like I saw a lot of stuff that I wouldn't want my kid to see, and so it's troubling. I want to find a convention, and I'd like to hope maybe that at some point I could take my kid to a convention as somewhere, if it be FWA or somewhere else. But there definitely are some things in the public eye that I would not really think are appropriate for kids.
I wonder if the same thing kind of applies. Again, another convention I've never been to, but one of the bigger ones is Comic Con. Now, Comic Con obviously isn't just comic books, and in the past couple decades, the industry around comic books has developed into a more mainstream thing where you've got an Avengers movie, like three or four Avengers movies, or not what is they called, Marvel movies or whatever, every year. But there's some there's some really inappropriate stuff that kind of goes on. A lot of the characters in comic books. I don't think. I mean, if you disagree with me here and you're thinking, "Oh, no, no, comic books are all wholesome," maybe a 1950s Superman comic book, but since then, the skin tight jumpsuits and the revealing outfits for the female characters in particular, that's extremely prevalent in comics. And when you extend this to not just Western comics, but also kind of Japanese style comics as well, and the entire culture around all the TV shows and movies and stuff like that. You have such a broad spectrum of media that's being gathered together. I think I think you would honestly have a very similar problem. I don't know necessarily that. I mean, again, I've never been to. The only convention I've ever been to was DEF CON, and that is not something that I would bring my kids to. But for different reasons, it's just I think they would be bored out of their mind. Um, but I don't know, it just strikes me that whenever you get a large group of people together, first of all, that's going to be an issue, but second of all, when the people are gathered together specifically for media, for drawn or, animated or anything like that, you're going to have this concern. And I don't know if it would be comparable at a Comic Con or if it's more so at like a furry convention. So I wonder if I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that there should be perhaps going forward, uh, kind of convention practice to say, okay, this is a convention where if there's inappropriate stuff at all present, maybe just kids shouldn't come, minors shouldn't come because there's always going to be a problem with segregating that. And then you've got kind of different conventions. Or is that am I thinking that that's like that's too
I
much
don't
to
know.
handle?
I don't know. Like, I really think that there is some potential for things to be improved because, like, the whole idea of having panels that are labeled after dark is supposed to be look, there are some things that people want to explore and do that are explicitly adult. And some of those things that are adult don't automatically mean bad, they just mean mature, right? It's not necessarily something appropriate for kids, but depending on what it is, it might actually be perfectly fine for even a Christian adult, right? And you have to kind of wrestle with that with your own Christian liberty to discern like what is good and what is not good, what builds up and what tears down. But the thing that most notably that I saw that actually like I thought, yeah, I'm not so sure about this, was that a lot of people when they're in fursuit would, or even out of fursuit, would incorporate a lot of leather kink stuff into their cosplay, and so it would just be displayed as normal cosplay. And to me, that was a bit problematic. I mean, one of the things that if you don't know what it is, that some people might look at and not realize that there's something weird going on is the wolf pup thing. There's a lot of people wearing wolf pup masks that
Are
are that
those the leather dog face
yes.
mask things?
People have apparently made some in these bright colors that that if you're uninitiated, which I don't really know a whole lot about that kind of stuff because I'm not involved in it. But it just looks like some sort of like weird mask that somebody's wearing for cosplay or you know if it weren't in that context, it might even look kind of neat, but I do know what that is, and there's a shocking number of people wearing stuff like that, but there's a lot more than that, right? There's people leading each other around in leather harnesses and stuff. And one of the reasons I think that there might be hope is that while I'm not sure that I'm thrilled about it if it leads to people being able to more separate the things that are not appropriate from children from the things that are, then it might be a positive thing. A lot of conventions have been starting to have these little what FWA calls it, moonlight festivals, which are explicitly like a very big ballroom event only for adults where people can be a bit more open with some of those things that they want to explore. And so while while I don't think that's something that Christians should be participating in myself, I do think that if that kind of event were to be promoted as this is the place for this, and the rest of the time should not be a place where this is visible, then that could possibly be a fix for things. But other than like until that gets cleaned up, like I'm not so sure.
Yeah, my concern would be in a case where you've got okay, well, we've got after hours type stuff at these conventions, whether it's a furry convention, anime thing, whatever it is. Um, as long as you're having these events, even if they're kind of like after hours at night, the people participating in this and the artists or whatever, the people contributing to this are still going to be there on the convention floor the rest of the days. And I don't know that it's really possible for them to separate. They say, okay, well, I'm going to wear this costume for this nighttime party type thing, but then I'm also going to wear it around on the convention floor. I don't think it's possible for them to separate what for them as kind of turned into a sexual thing, and to say, okay, well, I'm going to be wholesome for during the daytime in the exact same context. It's just I've turned my rating down to PG.
Well, in my experience, people don't cosplay the entire time, and some people bring multiple like ways to cosplay. Like you may have somebody that wants to cosplay just in a more typical fashion, or just dress up in their cute furry attire with the tail and stuff. And then they may also want to fursuit, but you're not going to fursuit for the whole convention. I don't know of anybody that fursuits the entire convention. But then like some of the stuff that I'm talking about would be fursuit plus leather attire, right? And the fursuits that I don't really recall seeing any fursuits that just on their own were inappropriate. And so like it's not that like people would not wear their costume. It's just that there's certain elements of their costume that like save that for the other thing, right? Maybe even if it was just like, let that be after a certain hour. And that might be unpopular. And I think there are some people that would probably just be totally fine with just having conventions become completely adult. And if people wanted to go the way of having some conventions that were explicitly for adult, like Megaplex seems to be opting for, which probably is just one of those things they're doing for like practical reasons, then that would be fine. And you could probably establish another convention somewhere that is supposed to be intended as being explicitly family friendly at all times, although that would be hard to moderate. But I do think that it is possible because I don't think that anybody who is wearing that cosplay would just have to wear it the whole time. And
Now, yeah, what you bring up actually, so this might be okay. Well, reading the article, and we see the article, and we say, "Oh man, what are these weirdos in Florida up to?" And they're banning children from this, and why do you think they would have to do this? But and it seems completely negative, but one of the things you bring up might actually be a positive aspect. I know I've talked with you before, and there's a constant struggle within the Christian furry community, as I understand, that there are people who say, you know what, we're not involved, we are not supporting these sorts of sinful behavior. We don't want a part of that. We just want cartoons and dressing up and playing make believe and whatever else. Um, a positive thing that may come out from this is polarization. If you have people, if you have conventions that are like, yeah, we've got some good stuff during the day, but at the nighttime we've got bad stuff, and they're trying to balance how to keep these two things separate. It might be better overall just to say, look, here's a convention where you've got this sinful stuff happening, and you can't be a minor, you can't show up to this at all, period. And then people say, well, I don't want to be involved in that stuff, but I also want to hang out and wear costumes and get comic books and stuff like that. Where do I go? And a positive result of this, I mean, maybe this is wishful thinking. A positive result of this might be that you have people developing things like completely wholesome or even Christian furry conventions, where you have that polarization where it's like, okay, there are now two communities. There's the communities where it's either sometimes slash all the time engaged in sinful stuff, and there's communities where it says, no, we're dedicated to this wholesome stuff. We don't want any of that. We don't want any of that here, and we want this to be 100% day and night safe place for adults and children. I mean, yeah, again, maybe that's wishful thinking. I don't know. I don't know the insides of the community. I don't know if there's a movement to kind of push for that sort of thing. But do you think that that would be something that the community would eventually want to develop, that they'd want to develop like
see, I don't know. I don't know, honestly. I mean, especially just because, like, one, how many people do you have that want to go to conventions for just one thing or the other? Would it be enough to make numbers? Because one of the things that keeps some of these conventions going is probably just the sheer number. Like, they're nonprofits, at least the ones that I know of, and they'll support some charity, but like, you know, you're having a lot of people attend is probably important. So segregating would would mean possibly like losing some of that income. Of course, I'm sure Megaplex probably taken a pretty hit from that, but I don't know. Maybe it's actually not that bad. But I don't know. It's tricky because there's been people in the past to push for like, we need to split the furries, right? There's the whole stuff that I don't really know much about, like the burn furs, but there's also been people back when I first joined on christianfurs.net that were like saying we need to make our own little group and call it the Puries. And then there's been people who said like, okay, for people that are not into uh NSFW, whatever, who don't do mature stuff, we call them fuzzies, and that's actually a term that's, like,
Oh, I've
recognized
just been
by
using that
them.
as like a slur against your people. I didn't realize
Oh,
that that
no,
was a
people
designated
like,
term
there are
for
people
something.
that actually have used the term fuzzy to describe a furry who is not involved in anything, of mature content. At least that's how I remember it, but I think that's on Wiki.
I don't know. Okay, here's what's really bugging me about this concept um, is that it seems to be, I don't know. It seems to make it pedantic to not want to. It seems to be treating it as almost pedantic to not want to engage in sinful behavior. Say, oh, those are the the immature furries or whatever, and we can't have mature stuff around them or whatever. And I don't know. Even in normal media, I find it kind of insulting to say, oh, this is, for mature audiences only. It's like, no, this is sinful, bad stuff that nobody should be participating in. And mature people can avoid sinful stuff. So, say, oh, well, that's a furry convention for children and stuff like, no, maybe, I don't know. It just, it bugs me.
I mean, yeah, but the thing is some of these terms are self-adopted.
Right,
Because some
right,
people would say, like, I would rather not call myself a furry because they don't want the negative association with it. And then some people definitely would agree with you, like, no, this is not a thing because the word encapsulates the entire fandom. But then,
right.
it's not well defined. Depending on who you ask, some people think that it should have all of the adults baked into it. They will tell you that that is legitimately just part of it. And when you look at the origins of the subculture, it's like, well, yeah, there was some adult stuff in that, but that doesn't mean that that's how everyone participating now engages with the fandom. Or
Yeah,
culture.
I think a similar comparison would be stage theater. And if you look back at kind of the early Christian church, stage theater would be largely pornographic. There was, if you were an actor, you were known as a liar and a prostitute. It was something offensive, and this was how they would draw crowds, as it would just be offensive jokes and inappropriate material and stuff on stage. Now, even if you want to say, okay, well, this is how stage acting came about. And it came about with these negative roots. Does that necessarily mean that now, if you go to a play that, a high school play or something like that, that's in and of itself a bad thing? So I think that there is a possibility for redemption there. I don't think that necessarily the beginnings of this culture need to define it through and through for the rest of time. You could just have people who say, you know what, oh, these cartoons are neat, or oh, I like making stuff out of, I don't know, foam and I don't know, whatever the material, the hair stuff, the fur, the fake fur material thing. I can see a lot of people getting involved in the creative aspects and consumptive aspects of it without getting involved in the sinful aspects of it. But yeah, I think it's so recent that it's so hard to divorce the culture from its origins. Just people historically think of, oh yeah, that's associated with this sinful stuff. Um, so I understand people coming up with terms and saying, "Hey, I want to distinguish myself." I'm not one of those. So I have to tell people, as a Lutheran, sometimes I say, "No, I'm not one of those Lutherans. I'm a Lutheran, but I'm not one of those Lutherans." So to segue this a little bit, you're a father, and I assume that you want to take care of your kids. That this is a goal in your life as a father. How would you navigate this ground with them if they, I don't know, if they become interested and they're like, hey, I like drawing, or I like, stuff like that. Is this something where you would steer them away from? Well, first of all, would you steer them away from kind of conventions in general, and then second of all, the culture in general? How would you navigate that, or have you really kind of thought that out?
I haven't had a good chance to think through it too much, and I'm sure that like any thoughts I've had, it's gonna have to evolve, right, as I go. I mean, before being a parent, when we would have parents interact with us and say, "Hey, my kid says they're into this furry stuff, so I was trying to find a way for them to be involved in this thing that they like, but that would be a safe space, or maybe that would be compatible with their faith, whatever." And we would try to dialogue with some of them, like if, especially like if they asked for advice. Some people have had a little bit of conversation with us, and we one of the things we would try to say is we encourage you to always be involved with what your kids are doing online, just period, right? Adults should be involved with what their kids are doing online, and I do think that there's an element of, yeah, that should be monitored. There does come a point where your kids are adults and they're going to need some privacy, but that doesn't happen from the time they turn like old enough to operate a computer. And one of the other things we tried to encourage people was be involved. Like, don't just be like engaged in like knowing about what they're doing, but be involved and be supportive. That doesn't mean, just saying okay to whatever, but you can be interested and like try to see what your kid's doing in a positive light and see positive opportunities for those interests without having as opposed to just saying, "Oh, somebody else is doing this in a sinful way, so it's bad and you need to stop." Especially because some of the things that we've like heard from people who were in the fandom, who were minors, was that their parents did not like it. They were there, didn't and did not want their parents to know that they were being involved with it because they just weren't okay with it at all. And so it's like what we'll see sometimes is that kids will have a tendency, or teenagers will have a tendency to want to hide that part of their life from their parents because their parents are like not even willing to keep an open mind to what their kids are interested to. So it's like I want to be able to follow that advice. And like honestly, me being involved in the fandom, I want my kid to be involved in the furry fandom to enjoy the things that I enjoy on. Whether or not that's responsible or not, I don't know yet. And it's weird too, because like I have seen like such, you know, raunchy parts of the fandom. I've seen some stuff that's like, yeah, that's not okay, and people self-identifying as like this is something that should be like sexually explicit and stuff. But I've also seen really awesome stuff. I've seen very wholesome artwork, and I've seen good Christian artwork, and I have also seen, uh, if I recall correctly, I was trying to find the video and I didn't find it, but I want to say like I've seen furry couples who would go fursuiting, and they had a fursuit for their toddler, and so they would go as a family through the convention space fursuiting, and it's the cutest thing, and the kids have a ball, right? I
I'm
have
trying to
seen
imagine like these
kids
little
with their own fursuit.
Ewok-sized
Yeah, I've
teddy
even
bears
seen
running
I
around.
know like, I've also seen, like, in a couple cases, like, parents who weren't into the fandom at all, who were walking with their kid through a convention space, and the kid cosplaying, and some I think, like, sometimes maybe even having a fursuit, and I think that that has the potential to be, like, a really positive experience, but the environment's gotta be right, you know?
And there's
You
gotta be I think and you said this at the beginning, there's gotta be involvement, and involvement sometimes also means control. It doesn't mean necessarily, you dictate every single thing that your child thinks, says, and does, but if you're involved, and okay, let's say you're that parent and you're like, okay, I don't get why my kid's into this weird stuff, but I'm going to go to this comic convention or whatever this convention with him and walk around. Like you, even not fully understanding what's going on around you, you can be like, okay, no, we're not going over there. I can see from a distance that we're not going to get involved in that aspect there. Yeah, there's I think one I don't know. There are two problems that I think are at the root of this with parents, and one of them is control. One of them is if parents are afraid to say no and say, look, you're not going to get involved. I'm not going to pay for this. I'm not going to let you go unsupervised to a convention in Florida. Whatever. I'm not going to let you have unsupervised access to the internet. I'm not going to let. Your job as a parent is to raise your kids and be involved. And sometimes, often, this means saying no when the children don't understand what's bad for them. But the primary problem here is that involvement is parents not being involved. Whether it's like, oh, my kid's into this weird, anime stuff or whatever. My kid's into this, any video gaming. My kid's into, some sport that I don't like or whatever and the parent immediately kind of turns off interaction with their kids. Oh, I'll just dump my kid off uh, soccer practice. I hate soccer. I'm not going to have anything to do with it, but I'm going to, just kind of leave him there and be uninvolved. Involvement is so key. And if you're worried as a parent, you're like, oh, I'm worried about my kids being involved in the wrong stuff, doing the wrong things, making the wrong choices. Well, guess what? You're a mom, you're a dad. Go with them, walk with them, walk by their side. Raise them up in the proper way, so that they don't depart from it. Be you cannot parent without being involved, but
Right.
sometimes being involved means being involved in dumb stuff, and you're like, you know, I so
It's like
confession, my son will maybe never hear this, but I don't really care about superheroes. I think Spider-Man is dumb. Like I like the games a little bit and in the comic. Okay, I get why it would be neat, but just you're like, I'm Spider-Man, 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 all Spider-Man, all day, every day, Spider-Man, Batman, once in a while, but then Spider-Man, and then to me, it's like, okay, it's 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 dumb, but I will totally play Spider-Man running around the house pretending to shoot webs at my kids because that's my son. I want to be involved in his interests, even if I don't share that interest at all. Um, I mean, I'm not a great dad, so if I could do that, I'm sure most dads and moms can be involved with their kids' weird interests and hobbies and interests that they don't share.
this discussion can go on so many branches right now.
Yeah, I should limit my
Uh,
sentences.
no, I'm just
You're
saying,
like,
like,
first of all, Spider-Man is the greatest creation since.
there's so many things to talk about. So many things to talk about. Like, just trying to keep some commentary short, right? Trying to work my way from the latest back to the earlier thoughts, I guess. Um, One is I want to say that kids are going to learn a lot of stuff from how we interact with them, right? So if I want my son to, per se, be interested in the things other people are doing and be interested in the things that I'm interested in, one of the ways to do that is to model that behavior by being interested in what he's interested in, asking him what he thinks about and being interested as he gets older. And I think that will teach him, oh, at some point it'll click. My dad always asked me what I liked and what was interested in. So it might help me to get to know other people better by asking them what they're interested in. And then maybe the epiphany, huh, my dad's a human being. What's he interested in? Right? And so I think that's an important part of just like having them develop, especially because I think another thing too that I want my kid to recognize, like I want them to be self-aware. And for them to be self-aware and recognize themselves as a person, I have to recognize him as a person myself actively. And once he can have that self-awareness and realize that he's a human being and start to think about himself in the world, I think that there's a lot of really good conclusions that can come out of that. And then another one of my friends that will show me stuff like he's my age and stuff that he'll be doing with his dad at my age, like uh, is really cool. Like he helps his dad out with the band that he does. Like he does the sound for them and stuff. And it seems like he's always had like a really awesome relationship with his parents. And I asked him shortly after our son came, like, what advice can you give me? What is it that you feel like your dad did that made it to where you had such a relationship with him, where you were interested in spending time doing things with him that he was interested in? And he said, honestly, just spending time with me and being interested in spending time with like that. It's really that simple. So I think being involved in what your kids are wanting to do, like it doesn't have to be fun to me, right? You don't have to like Spider-Man. Whether or not you like Spider-Man isn't the point, right? God made us. He wants us to be a sort of children to him. And one of the things that comes with that is we display his glory, but we do it in ways that hasn't really been done before. We do it in our own unique way. He made us individuals and didn't come in as Christ to abolish who we are, but for us to do it better. And this brings me like to another point that I was thinking of earlier. One of the episodes of the Bible Project that I was listening to recently, this was really awesome. When you watch the story of Paul as he's going through the prison system, the Roman legal system, as he's appealed to Caesar, he keeps being like slightly like done incorrectly by the powers that be, and he would remind them, isn't this what your law says? But it's not like he's being cheeky. He didn't have to do that. He knew that he was gonna be persecuted, and the person speaking the podcast, I really think they're right about this, and I think that this is really powerful. Paul felt like it was extremely important that he encouraged the people around him to uphold their ideals to the best of their ability, and if they're good ideals. So it's like Christians don't come into the world to look at the entire world and say nothing here is good. It's to look at how it's distorted and encourage people to carry out what's good in the world in a less distorted fashion. And shining the light of the kingdom doesn't mean that you burn down everything that man has ever done, but encourage them, remind them there are these ideals that you uphold that are good ideals, but you don't actually follow them. So do better, right? And so one of the things that we do as being co-citizens or dual citizens of God's kingdom and the world is to be part of earthly culture, but do it in a way that is wholesome, that is honoring to Christ. And in doing so, that means honoring to other people, right? Whenever we talk about whether or not kids should be at the furry fandom or furry convention rather, and this law. Well, why would there be a need for a law like this at all? Well, it's to protect the children. Conventions, if I go to a convention, it's because I want to have a good time and I want to enjoy it, right? But my enjoyment of something is not all like the most important thing in the world. And if it comes at the expense of children being exposed to things that they shouldn't be exposed to because other people can't behave themselves, or maybe I've done something that I shouldn't have done in front of children, like that's not okay. But I think that by being involved in convention and hoping and maybe, imagine this, praying for a better furry convention or for people to try to um what's the word? Realize conventions in a way that is hospitable to a more family environment, at least in part. I think is kind of part of that whole idea. If people enjoy the furry fandom and there's Christians in it, and there are people in the furry fandom who see it for more than just like how we can treat each other as meat, right? Then it seems that we would want to be involved even with the secular people to encourage them. Like you say that, like you enjoy just the artwork sometimes. Some people want it to be explicitly some other thing, but there's some people who definitely like to enjoy the fandom for the fact that it's a really cool genre of artwork, or they like to role play, or they like to express themselves through the character. And some of the things some like people want to stand up for, I think, are good things. And encouraging people to make those more present and do a better job of upholding those ideals is a positive experience. I think that that's one weird way that we can bring the kingdom further into this world. Now, how to have that mindset and bring a kid up to have that mindset is a very weird question, because there is an aspect of this where I have to think about how do I protect my child, but protecting my child, if it means to have him grow up um, without being taken away by sin, but also to have him grow up understanding what the gospel is about and what being a Christian is about, might mean that sheltering him too much is also dangerous. Because if I want to model good behavior and how a Christian should be, then that might mean that I have to allow my son to see me living these sorts of things out. And that doesn't mean that at the age of 3 that I should take him to FWA, but it might mean that at some point in his life, if I see a point where it is safe to take him with me to some sort of event, maybe if I'm going to host another Christian Furs panel or something, for him to be able to see that you can have an interest and let Christ shine through that interest is an important thing for him to see me do.
It's interesting, as you're describing this, I'm thinking about there's a this is one of the problems that Martin Luther had with the cloister system of monasteries. Monasteries originally, when they came out or when they were developed, they existed in the world among the population of believers and unbelievers, and they would often, provide services and make beer, do all kinds of other stuff like that. be involved in the community. But at a certain point, some monasteries developed into a system called a cloister. You think about like a clamshell close up. They would shut themselves off from the rest of the world. They would completely isolate themselves from the rest of the world. And Martin Luther and others pointed out that no, this is absolutely not what God has called you to do. Now, you may think, okay, well, I won't be involved in sin because every day I'll have nothing but, a brown monastic robe and I'll just be chanting day in and day out. But it's not what God has called you to do. God has called Christians to be in the world, not of the world, but in the world, interacting with other Christians, because this is one of the primary ways that he has chosen to share the faith is involvement with other people and cloistering. I mean, if your biggest fear, if you're listening to this, one of the six people who listen to this podcast, your biggest fear is, what do I do if my kid one day grows up and becomes a furry or whatever? And if you succeed in your life in preventing your child from either A, being a furry, or B, being involved in a specific type of sin, it does him no good if he doesn't have the gospel. It does no benefit to a person if he manages to go his entire life avoiding as much sin as possible if he doesn't have faith in Christ, if he doesn't have, a savior who died on the cross for his sins.
Right.
It's so easy to get so hung up on sin and the fear of sin, and that itself is idolatry. That itself is a lot of times, I'll have people reach out to me and they'll say, I can't stop doing this sin, or I keep being involved in this sin, and I'm terrified. And the devil has tricked them into fixing their eyes not on the cross, not on the death of their Savior, not on the forgiveness of sins, but instead they are focused on themselves and if they can beat this sin. And if they can beat this sin becomes the sole, the sole thing that they're striving for. And at the end of the day, if they get too focused on that idolatry, that leads them into, believing that they can somehow save themselves, even if they don't, predict that's the direction it's going to go. This is why Martin Luther's famous line, "Sin boldly." A lot of people hate that line, but if you understand what he means by it, if you live your life in constant fear that you're going to sin, uh, then you're making an idol out of your own behavior. You are
Oh
not
yeah.
trusting that Jesus died on the cross for your sins.
That was actually something huge. Like, so this is a reformed, I think they're Reformed Baptist, but podcast Theocast. Theocast was really helpful to me because they're big, like their tagline is basically like helping weary pilgrims to rest in Christ, something like that. And their big push, like one of their big themes, is for to help people realize that pietism is not so healthy. Like there is an aspect to Christian life that is pious, that is concerned with living righteously to the best of your ability. But pietism, where you think that like you are a good Christian, or it is to be a good Christian by being able to be as righteous as possible, actually misses the point. Because when Jesus came to the Sermon on the Mount, and gave the Sermon on the Mount and said, right, that you have to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, he wasn't trying to say it was an attainable goal.
This was a challenge.
You were
Go ahead.
supposed to walk away from that being, oh God, what can I do so that after you realize that, after your knees buckle and you realize that you are completely crushed by the law and that you are completely incapable of ever doing it justice, that you can fully recognize that you have to have somebody else who is able to carry it for you. So all of this, like, I can't, I have to make sure that I don't ever do any sin whatsoever because otherwise I'm going to be in danger and I'm going to be swept away. It's like, well, you're forgetting that your righteousness, as good as you think it is still worthless, right? And I've gotten in trouble for saying that before. Somebody got mad because I thought like that I said righteous was worthless. What I really mean when I say that is like when you compare your righteousness to Christ's righteousness, your righteousness is not going to do anything for you. As a matter of fact, I think that our righteousness is probably like less for us and more for other people, right? When you're honoring the law of love and you're honoring God and you're being a righteous person, well, I think that that's actually a bit of a nuanced concept, what that should really look like. But you should understand that your righteousness is not going to add to your salvation, period. And Theocast's big push was if you think that your righteousness is adding to your salvation, then you have no salvation. if you take pure water of Christ's righteousness and you mingle it with a drop of your seeming righteousness, you've still made that water impure. Christ's righteousness has to be the only thing that saves you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Luther says again. He says, "God doesn't need your works; your neighbor does, or God doesn't need your love; your neighbor does."
I like that.
The 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 good works that a Christian does, the love that a Christian acts out, this should be in response. We can love because Christ first loved us, but that has to come first, and that has to be final. It has to be we are saved, therefore we can love others, not I have to stop doing this sin so I'm good enough for God to love me to to what? To die on the cross? He's already done that for you before you were even born. Before you even started sinning, God died on the cross. What can you contribute to, to what Christ has already done for you? It's I think there's there's a couple of lies that the devil uses regularly because people keep falling for them, and they get stuck in people's minds, and they sound pious. They sound, I want to be a righteous person. Good. We should all want to be righteous
Oh,
people.
yeah.
We should want to behave piously, chastely, in love, in all exercising the fruit of the spirit. All these things that's a good thing, but the temptation, the sin is when that becomes, that becomes more important than Christ's death on the cross. And that becomes not an outgrowth of who you are as an already saved Christian, but as something that, this is an essential part of my foundation. I must be good so I may be saved. It's such a it's such a common lie, but it's so easy to fall for. And it sounds so good. It sounds like, "Oh, why would I not want to be a good person so God can love me?" It's like, well, you can't be.
Right. And
Oh,
I feel like we find ourselves at another one of those weird paradoxical tug of wars, right? We have Proverbs telling us that if you will live wisely and chase after wisdom, then good things will come as a result. And then in the same section of literature, we have Ecclesiastes telling us that you can be the most wise person in the world and you're still going to die, that life is going to come to an end and there's just going to be trouble for you, right? Because we're in a broken, messed up world. And so we have this tug of war of we we can't live righteously, not truly righteously, meaning that it's perfect, right? We can live out a caricature of righteousness at best,
we can
but
approximate it, yeah.
right, but we can't really achieve it. But knowing that, and knowing that even though we could be as Job and live perfectly and blamelessly and still find that everything falls apart for us, does that mean we don't try? Oh, no. We still should try because it's the correct thing to do. And somebody whose heart is aligned with God's sees that way of living and that mindset of living as the most beautiful thing that we should aspire to. And I think we reach this similar paradox here where as a father, I have a responsibility to protect my son, but I also have a responsibility to educate my son in how to live in a fallen world. You want to protect your kid from a fallen world, but you also know that your kid's going to grow up to be an adult who has to live in that same fallen world. And you want that child to grow up to have this understanding of what it means to exist in this fallen world and not be taken by it, but still exist in it and possibly even have a positive change affected on it because Christ works through you. And that working through you actually can just look like you being your best self by letting the Holy Spirit transform how you think about the world and what you stand for.
Yeah, we have to fight against this false dichotomy that the world has presented where you have two choices as a parent. You can either be a completely hands-off parent and allow your child to engage in whatever he or she would like to and not be restrictive at all, or you have to completely isolate your child and put them in a bubble and, like the Amish, kind of make them completely unaware of the outside world. But if you look at the Bible itself, if you look at even the contents of Scripture, there are lots of bad stuff. There's lots of sin that is described in Scripture. And if you're if God is teaching us as children, if God is teaching us, He is making us aware of the pitfalls that others have fallen into, and we can do that. We can do that as parents. We can, we don't have to make them completely ignorant and say, okay, I'm not going to tell you about anything bad in the world. Um, but but again, this is kind of, you teach in an intentional manner. You say, I'm going to prepare my child for what he might encounter in the world. That doesn't mean I necessarily have to directly expose him to it, and this doesn't mean that I have to have a hands-off approach and let him figure it out and just run into it on his own.
Right.
But it's yeah, it's like if you want to teach your kid how to behave around a dog, and dogs are wonderful and great, but dogs can also be dangerous for small children in particular, is you approach the dog hand in hand with your child, and you say, here's the dog, here's how you pet them. Don't pull his tail, don't jump on the dog, don't hit the dog, don't do anything like that, because a dog could potentially hurt you. You don't just let the child loose and say, figure it out. And you also don't keep the child isolated his entire life from a dog, and then at some point that isolation ends, and now he has no idea how to interact with a dog without antagonizing it. You you you're intentional. You walk them through this sort of training. You walk side by side with them. There's a teaching method called a peripatetic method. Peripateo means kind of a walking, talking conversation. To walk and learn, to walk beside somebody and learn
Right.
as a teacher and a student.
And walking beside somebody does not mean carrying them. So that's one of the really like cool things. Like I feel like this might be related to the conscious discipline that my wife uses at work with kids. It's a really cool premise, but I'm probably drawing false connections. But like there's this element where you're like, okay, I want to educate my kid about how to make good decisions and how to think about the world. But if you want somebody to make good decisions, they have to practice making good decisions. And if you want them to think in a positive, good way about how they interact with the world, they have to think about the world, which means that there's a point in that education where you have to like ease them into they make decisions and they get to think, and being involved for that while they're still developing means like having conversations. I can let my son come to his own conclusions, and sometimes they might not be the right conclusions yet. I don't have to just bash him over the head though and say like, well, that's not how it works, right? He's going to
You're never
have
allowed to try again. Yeah.
he's allowed to have his own thoughts about how the world works, and he's allowed to be mistaken. But if I can make an environment where we can even have disagreements as it becomes a teenager, and I can allow him to have his own thoughts about the world as a child, I feel like that can create a safe space for us to have conversations about. But I mean, yeah, I'm going to give him input, and I'm going to give him a lot of input early. And then as he gets older and becomes an adult, I will eventually have to just understand that my son's going to make his own decisions. He's going to think what he thinks. And it's not my job to sit and make that up for him, especially because I'm a flawed human being who's not got everything right. But as he's, especially like as far as making decisions goes, I have to let him experience making a decision and it being the wrong decision, but also talking through how to make that decision. Because if me and my son have a discussion as he gets older and he comes to a conclusion about what he thinks is the way that something should be handled, and we talk about it, and he really is convinced that it's the right way, it might be that the only way he's going to learn any better is to just make that bad decision. And of course, there is the big disclaimer on this that depending on what it is, I might have to be a bit more energetic with my approach. And I'm not trying to
No,
say that
Dad, I'm not going to get addicted to heroin. Well, why don't you go ahead and try, find out,
yeah,
see how
and I'm
wrong
not
you
saying
are.
that again, this is not a hands-off approach, but I think that there's this gradient that has to be eased into. I don't think that kids grow up like, I mean, we hopefully everybody's aware that teenager is a human construct, but there's not some magical age where my son's going to wake up and be like, "Huh, I am an autonomous adult. I have achieved the enlightenment of independence." It's not like that. He's going to have to practice growing into being an autonomous human being. And I think that I can help him to do that effectively, but it's going to have to be in recognition that my son is not some object. He's not a second class human. He is a human that does not have the experience that I have, but I can ease him into a place of being able to be experienced and wise. I think, I hope, at least in
Yeah,
my
and
prayer.
hopefully in instruction and that discipline, as you continue to interact with him, as he gets right and wrong answers, makes right and wrong decisions, then hopefully the end point of that is that, okay, fast forward to the future where you're no longer, walking necessarily side by side with him. If he makes a wrong decision, that he knows that he can come to you and say, "Look, I messed up, Dad. I need your help. I thought I knew how to handle this situation, and I didn't." And rather than being, scared of you that you're going to react in a certain way, and not help him, he's going to intentionally seek you out and say, "I really messed this one up, but I trust that you still have my well-being at heart, and you're gonna be there to help me." But that has to be built up. That's a lifelong discipline. That has to be built up after over years. It's not just a single issue.
Right. I feel like I think and like on my list of things I'd like to do, I need to add to the bottom, write a short story fan fiction of conversations that the father and the prodigal son had after the fact.
Oh, that would be fascinating.
Welcome back, son. And then after the
So, how did that
party,
work out
they
for you?
say, "So, son, I would like to talk about your
Yeah.
experiences."
Eating bean pods, huh? Oh, hanging out with pigs?
"Oh, dad,
Yes.
everything I did was just it was so wrong." It was like, "Listen, son, calm down. Look, we've been over this. You're home. You messed up. Great. But I need us to talk about like the end because I'm sure there may have been some decisions that you made that were the right decision. For instance, you made the decision to come home. That was a pretty smart move. So maybe you made some other smart decisions. So can we talk about maybe which decisions were good and which decisions weren't so good and what the difference between them was?"
All right. With that, thank you so much again to the CFF. Thank you to Tomcat for willing to be second chair with me here today, and I think we had a very productive conversation. Are there any final parting shots that you wanna get off before we end it for today?
Ah, gee. I don't know. Like this law, I understand why the megaplex is reacting the way that they are. I think that there's some weirdness about how we're reading what that law says, maybe, but they're probably making a safe bet, and it's probably a good decision as far as like whether or not like conventions are safe space for kids. I don't know. I want to hope that there is a place in the future though where there can at least be some furry convention space that can be safe for kids to attend because I think that the furry fandom can be a positive experience for children, but it doesn't need to be random 13-year-olds that are interacting with grown adults on the internet unsupervised. I don't think that's what it's going to look like. And definitely not sending somebody underage to a convention by themselves. That's probably the other thing too, right? One of the aspects that comes with whether or not kids should be present in a furry convention has a lot to do with whether or not you're accompanying them.
All right. So with that, we're coming up at about an hour. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much to the Christian Furry Fellowship for allowing us to have the podcast on their server. Unfortunately, if you're not on the server, you didn't get to see how involved the entire community was in the chat room, kind of the peanut gallery over there, commenting on the conversations. Again, thank you so much to everybody listening. God bless you all and take care.